So today we're going to be solving trig equations. So we've already been doing it, you just haven't known it. I haven't named it that. And so what we did in the last video is I gave you sine of an angle equals 1/2 square root of 3, and you had to figure out the two angles, or the four angles. And so you would figure out 60 and 120 by looking at the unit circle and then figure out your negative ones. And so what we're going to be doing now is just doing into slightly harder equations. Today, just because I want to focus on the equations only, the directions say 0 to 360. So what that means is no negative angles. So if your directions say that on the test, all it means is just give me the two positive angles. You don't need to give me the two negatives. So the first example, what I do is I put my line down and we're solving it like a normal equation. But our goal in this case is to get the trig function alone. So cosine, I want to get that alone, cosine theta. And so what we would do first is add over the 1. So I have 2 cosine theta equals 1. And then I divide by the 2 out front. So now I have cosine of theta equals 1/2. And this should look familiar. And so I go to my unit circle. I figure out where cosine equals 1/2. So cosine equals 1/2 right here at 60. So that's my first angle. Cosine is also positive in the fourth quadrant. 60 reference angles right there at 300. So 60 and 300 are your two answers. The next one, my goal is to get tangent theta alone, so I add over the 3 first. So tangent, and there's a squared, equals 3. So to get rid of the square, you do it just like you normally would. You would square root it. So I have tangent of theta equaling square root of 3. And so I go to my unit circle. Tangent equals square root of 3 right here at 60. Tangent is positive in this quadrant. The 60 reference angle is right there at 240. So 60 and 240 are your two answers. So the next one, I add over the 1. Now that 2 that's in between the tangent and theta, you can't just divide it over, unfortunately. So what you're going to do is figure out where tangent equals 1 first. So tangent equals 1 right here at 45 degrees. So that's my first one. And then the tangent's also positive in this quadrant. And so the 45-degree reference angle there is 225. So 45 and 225. But what this equals is 2 theta. And so to figure out what just theta equals, what I do is I divide over the 2 to the angles. So you don't divide the 2 over until you found your two angles. So 45 divided by 2 is 22.5. And 225 divided by 2 is 112.5. So those are your two answers. For number 4 and 5, what we have to do is factor them. And so we have 2 cosine squared plus cosine. And so if that confuses you, you could always put in variables for right now. So instead of cosine squared, I'll use x squared. And instead of cosine, I'll just use x. And you could factor that and then sub the cosines back in for the x's. So if I was going to factor that, that has a GCF of x, and I'm left with 2x plus 1. And so I could just now replace the x's back with cosine, so it'd be cosine theta, and then 2 cosine theta plus 1. Or if you can see it right away when you're looking at the problem that they both have cosine and common, so you pull a cosine out and you're left with 2 cosine plus 1, then that's great too. So then what I do is kind of like what we used to do for asymptotes. I'm going to set both of these things equal to 0. So I'm going to set the cosine theta equal to 0, and I'm going to solve it, which it's already solved. And I'm going to set that equal to 0 and solve that as well. So when I solve this one, I would subtract over the 1. And I would divide over the 2. So cosine theta equaling negative 1/2. And so then I have to figure out where cosine equals 0 and where cosine equals negative 1/2. So cosine equaling 0, that's not on the unit circle, but it is on this table. And so I look to see where cosine would equal 0. So look at the cosine columns. That cosine equals 0 right here at 90 degrees and at 270. So 90 and 270 are my answers for that particular one. Cosine equaling a negative 1/2, I look at my unit circle. So cosine equals a half right here at 60 degrees, but it's negative a half. And so that means I'll be looking in these two quadrants. So the 60-degree reference angles right there are 120 and 240. So 120 and 240 are my two answers for this second one. So this equation has four answers: 90, 270, 120, and 240. So number 5. Number 5 is also a factoring problem. And so if the signs confuse you, instead of sine squared, I can use x squared. 3 sine theta is like 3x plus 2. And now hopefully you can see that now we can slide and divide this. And so I put a 2 up top and a negative 3 down bottom. So what multiplies to 2 and adds to negative 3 is negative 2 and negative 1. So this would be x minus 2, x minus 1. I can sub back these signs back in for x's. So I have sine theta minus 2 and sine theta minus 1. So I take both of these and I set them both equal to 0. And I solve both of them. So I would add over the 2 on this one and add over the 1 on this one. So I have sine theta equaling 2 and sine theta equaling 1. So sine theta equal 2, that is not on the chart or the unit circle. If it's not in either of those places, I'm going to just grab my calculator. And so I do second sine of 2. You get an error, so that's a dead end. So this one has no answers. So sine theta equaling 1, that's not on the unit circle, so I check my table here. So I go to my sine column and I figure out where it equals 1. It equals 1 at 90 and nowhere else. So the only answer to this one is 90 degrees. You will be having a video quiz tomorrow, and so this is one of my favorite memes. I think this otter is very cute. So write it down that I will be asking what adorable animal I put up, and it will be an otter.